What if the economic freedom you believe you have never truly existed? What if every choice you make, every opportunity your country has, and every financial outcome that shapes entire generations has been quietly predetermined by a system designed long before you were born? This is not about conspiracy or fantasy. It is about a structure so deeply embedded in global finance that most people mistake it for the natural order of the world. But when you look closely, when you strip away the comforting illusion that markets are neutral and choices are free, a disturbing truth emerges. The system guiding our economies was not built to be escaped. It was built to be obeyed. And once you see how it operates, it becomes impossible to unsee. Think about this. Why do nations that work, produce, innovate, and generate value still find themselves trapped in debt cycles that never end? Why do crises repeat the same patterns, almost like scripted events unfolding in slow motion? Why do the same institutions rise stronger after every disaster, while ordinary people are left weaker, poorer, and more dependent than before? These questions are not random. They point to a hidden framework, a blueprint engineered to keep the world moving in one direction. And every country, from the wealthiest superpowers to the smallest developing nations, is locked inside it. The real story begins when you realize that the system doesn't need chains or force to control people. It only needs to shape incentives, influence governments, and define what is considered normal. When everyone grows up inside the same structure, no one questions it. And when no one questions it, the system becomes invisible, almost like gravity. You don't see it. You just feel its effects every day in every economic decision you make. And here is what should trouble you the most. If this framework was designed to be permanent, if it was intentionally built to create dependence instead of prosperity, then the world you live in is not a marketplace. It's a mechanism, one that rewards a few, restrains many, and adapts quickly whenever someone tries to escape its reach. You already know the symptoms. Now you're about to see the machinery behind them. Before we move forward, tell me in the comments if you've ever felt like the economic game was rigged long before you entered it. Your insight matters because understanding this system starts with recognizing how it shapes your own life. And while you're here, make sure to like the video and check if you're already subscribed. Because the deeper we go, the more you'll realize how essential it is to understand the forces controlling our financial reality. When you trace the origins of this system back through history, something becomes unmistakably clear. It wasn't created suddenly or by accident. It emerged slowly, layer by layer, through decisions that looked harmless at the time, but fundamentally reshaped how nations interact with money and power. The earliest architects of this economic machinery understood one principle better than anyone else. Control the flow of credit, and you control the destiny of entire societies. And once that idea took root, the trajectory of global finance changed forever. Long before modern banking, empires rose and collapsed based on tangible resources, gold mines, fertile land, military strength. But as trade expanded and nations became more interconnected, a new kind of power appeared. It wasn't physical. It wasn't visible. It was the ability to lend money. The moment governments realized they could borrow instead of build, they unknowingly surrendered a part of their autonomy. The moment bankers realized they could lend instead of conquer, they discovered a path to influence more stable and more profitable than any empire built by force. But the real turning point came when debt stopped being temporary and became permanent. What began as emergency funding during wars and crises evolved into a structural dependency, a habit nations couldn't break. Countries found that borrowing allowed them to grow faster, solve problems quicker, and postpone difficult decisions. It felt like a shortcut to prosperity. But every shortcut has a price, and this one quietly shifted power away from democracies and into the hands of institutions that never face elections and never lose influence. Over time, the mechanism expanded. Bonds turned into markets. Markets turned into global networks, and global networks turned into a financial architecture so complex that most political leaders barely understand it. The people managing this architecture don't govern nations. They govern expectations, liquidity, risk, and the invisible levers that determine whether a society thrives or collapses. And they do it without borders, without term limits, and without public accountability. As countries grew comfortable relying on credit, the system grew stronger. Each loan created another link, another dependency, another way for influence to spread without ever looking like control. And what's most revealing is that every major shock in history, from wars to depressions, only made the system more entrenched. Nations rebuilt through borrowing. Institutions gained authority through crisis. And the architecture deepened its roots with every generation that accepted debt as normal. This is where the illusion becomes impossible to ignore. What you see today as a global economy didn't emerge through natural evolution. It was guided, shaped, and reinforced by structures created long before any of us arrived. And understanding how these early foundations were built is the first step to uncovering why escaping this system is far harder than most people imagine. As the system evolved, its architects discovered something even more powerful than lending to governments. They realized they could design the very structure of money itself, shaping not only how nations borrow, but how they function at their core. The shift from tangible currency to abstract financial instruments marked a turning point in global economic history. Once money became a concept rather than a resource, whoever controlled its creation no longer needed armies, territory, or political authority. They only needed influence over the institutions that defined its value. This was the moment when finance stopped being a tool and became an architecture. Instead of wealth arising from production, innovation, or natural resources, it began to emerge from credit expansion, liquidity management, and monetary engineering. Countries felt as though they were participating in normal economic activity, but in reality, they were operating inside a structure designed to guide their behavior. Every loan, every rate change, every policy shift extended the reach of an invisible framework that determined which nations would rise, which would stagnate, and which would remain perpetually dependent. The brilliance of this system lies in how subtle it is. Money supply no longer relied on gold or silver. It relied on decisions made behind closed doors by entities insulated from democratic pressure. And because these decisions were technical, wrapped in complex language like open market operations, reserve requirements, or yield curve management, most people, including many political leaders, couldn't challenge them even if they wanted to. The system became self-justifying. If it worked, it was credited to expertise. If it failed, the solution was simply more intervention, more control, more layers added to the architecture. But the real transformation came when international markets began linking their currencies, their debts, and their financial institutions into a single global network. Suddenly, a decision in one country could echo across continents in seconds. A crisis in one region could become a global event overnight. And in this interconnected world, the institutions that managed risk and liquidity became more powerful than the governments that supposedly oversaw them. With every new financial instrument created, derivatives, sovereign bonds, credit swaps, liquidity guarantees, the architecture grew more sophisticated. It wasn't just influencing economies anymore. It was shaping the rules by which economies were allowed to operate. Nations discovered that deviating from these rules came at a cost. Currency collapse, market retaliation, capital flight. The message was clear. The system wasn't optional. Participation wasn't voluntary. Compliance wasn't a choice. And yet, because the architecture blended so seamlessly into the global economy, most people never questioned where it came from or who benefited from its design. They simply adapted to it, unaware that the structure guiding their financial reality had long since replaced the old world of tangible wealth with a new era defined by mechanisms they could not see, let alone escape. As the financial architecture expanded, something unexpected happened. Crises stopped being moments of weakness for the system and began operating as essential components of its strength. Every shock that should have exposed its fragility instead tightened its grip. Nations entered each crisis believing they would regain control once stability returned, but each recovery left them more dependent, more intertwined, and more willing to surrender autonomy in exchange for temporary relief. The system had discovered its most powerful tool, the ability to turn instability into leverage. Economic crises were once natural consequences of mismanagement or conflict. But in a world governed by interconnected credit, markets, and liquidity cycles, they became opportunities to reshape entire societies. When markets froze, when currencies destabilized, when governments found themselves unable to respond, the institutions operating behind the scenes stepped in as saviors. They provided emergency loans, dictated restructuring plans, and imposed policies that aligned perfectly with the system's long-term interests. Nations didn't regain stability. They inherited a new set of obligations. This transformation turned crises into mechanisms of enforcement. A country facing financial collapse suddenly had no negotiating power. Its priorities shifted from sovereignty to survival. Under the pressure of collapsing markets, governments accepted terms they would have rejected in normal times: austerity mandates, asset privatizations, currency devaluations, and long-term repayment schedules that reshaped national destinies. The system didn't need to force compliance. Crises did that naturally. But the true sophistication lies in how predictable this cycle became. When nations borrowed heavily during good times, they unknowingly planted the seeds of their future vulnerability. When markets expanded, it created the illusion of progress. When the expansion reversed, countries rushed back to the same institutions that had helped design the conditions leading to the crisis in the first place. And each time they returned, the architecture solidified another layer, tightening the boundaries of what was economically possible. What emerges from this pattern is an unsettling truth. The system does not fear crisis. It relies on it. Crises are the checkpoints that reinforce its rules, reset expectations, and ensure that no country grows strong enough to operate independently of its mechanisms. Rather than disrupting the architecture, each shock renews it, widening the gap between those who manage the system and those who must survive within it. And this is the turning point most people never notice. While citizens experience chaos, uncertainty, and loss, the architecture becomes sharper, more unified, and more indispensable. A crisis doesn't weaken the system, it weakens everyone else. Tell me in the comments if you've ever noticed how every crisis seems to end with more control, more rules, and less autonomy for ordinary people. Your perspective might reveal patterns others still haven't seen. As the crises accumulated and the architecture adapted, something far more subtle began to unfold beneath the surface. The system developed internal stabilizers, mechanisms designed not only to preserve its structure during moments of turbulence, but to ensure its long-term dominance even when everything around it appeared fragile. These stabilizers didn't operate through force or visible authority. They worked quietly, through incentives, expectations, and deeply embedded financial norms that shaped how every nation behaved. One of the most powerful pillars was the normalization of perpetual debt. Once governments accepted that borrowing was an essential tool rather than a temporary necessity, the system effectively secured a permanent influence over national decision-making. Debt stopped being a burden to be eliminated and became a strategic instrument, a way to stimulate growth, manage crises, and maintain political stability. But the more comfortable nations grew with borrowing, the more deeply they sank into dependency, creating a cycle they could no longer break without risking collapse. Another stabilizer emerged through the global flow of capital. Money could cross borders faster than any government could react, and this mobility transformed markets into a silent voting machine. If a country experimented with policies that challenged the system's interests, whether through monetary reforms, protectionist measures, or attempts at financial independence, capital reacted instantly. Investors withdrew. Currencies fell. Markets punished the deviation. The message was unmistakable. Stability was only available to those who participated on the system's terms. But perhaps the most profound stabilizer was psychological. Over time, citizens, institutions, and even governments internalized the belief that the architecture was too complex to challenge. Economic models, academic theories, and expert commentary reinforced the idea that the system, while imperfect, was the only viable way to structure global finance. Alternatives were dismissed as unrealistic, dangerous, or naive. By shaping perception, the architecture ensured not just compliance, but acceptance. This psychological influence extended beyond academics and policymakers. Ordinary people began basing their lives on expectations created by the system, borrowing for education, borrowing for homes, borrowing for survival, Entire generations were raised inside a framework where personal and national debt were simply part of life. The architecture didn't need to enforce its rules. People lived by them instinctively, without questioning where those rules came from or who benefited from their persistence. As these stabilizers strengthened, the system achieved something unprecedented. It became self-sustaining. Even when shocks threatened individual nations, the architecture as a whole remained intact because its foundations were no longer external. They were embedded in global behavior, global belief, and global dependence. The illusion of choice remained, but the range of acceptable choices narrowed until every path led back to the same structure. And while governments and citizens believed they were adapting to modern economic realities, they were actually reinforcing the very mechanisms that limited their freedom. The architecture no longer needed to grow through conquest or crisis. It grew through routine, through repetition, through the simple fact that no one could imagine a world without it. As the system embedded itself into global behavior, it began expanding outward in ways that were almost invisible. Instead of projecting authority through domination or conquest, it spread through integration, reshaping economic relationships until entire nations found themselves aligned with its logic without ever consciously choosing to be. This was the quiet expansion phase, the moment when the architecture became less a structure imposed from above and more a gravitational force that pulled every economy into its orbit. The mechanism was simple: link nations through trade, finance, and monetary policy until separation became unthinkable. Once a country connected its financial system to global markets, it inherited not only opportunities but obligations. Its currency depended on external confidence. Its industries depended on foreign demand. Its banks depended on global liquidity. A misstep in one area could reverberate across the entire economy, forcing governments to act not according to national priorities, but according to the expectations of the system they had joined. International institutions became the custodians of this expansion. They offered access to credit, expertise, and global networks, framing their influence as cooperation rather than control. And because struggling nations often needed immediate relief more than long-term independence, they accepted the terms with little resistance. Each agreement, each restructuring plan, each consultation gently nudged countries further into the architecture, tightening the alignment between their economies and the system's foundational rules. Even nations that tried to resist found themselves drawn in through necessity. Global supply chains made economic isolation impossible. Digital markets erased geographic boundaries. Capital sought returns across continents, indifferent to borders or political ideology. The architecture didn't need to enforce uniformity. Global interconnectedness achieved it naturally. Once a country stepped into the flow of international finance, the system's gravitational pull did the rest. This expansion also reshaped what it meant to be sovereign. Traditionally, sovereignty meant control over territory, resources, and political decisions. But in the modern financial order, it meant the ability to maintain credibility, manage risk, and protect currency value. These were not political qualities. They were technical requirements defined by the architecture. Nations discovered that failing to meet these requirements came with immediate consequences: capital flight, credit downgrades, collapsing markets. Power shifted from governments to the institutions that defined these standards. And with each passing decade, the architecture grew both more resilient and more demanding. Countries could still govern themselves, but only within boundaries determined by forces they didn't control. Monetary policy had to align with global expectations. Fiscal decisions had to satisfy external investors. Economic development had to follow a path consistent with market logic. The more interconnected the world became, the narrower the path of autonomy grew. This wasn't domination through force. It was domination through structure. Countries didn't lose sovereignty because someone took it. They lost it because the system redefined it. And as the architecture expanded, it reshaped the world into a financial ecosystem where participation was unavoidable, and independence became less a reality and more a myth. As the architecture expanded and nations adapted to its boundaries, its influence began penetrating even deeper into the internal dynamics of societies. What most people never realize is that this system doesn't merely shape economies. It shapes decisions, identities, and entire national trajectories. The invisible mechanisms guiding monetary policy and credit flows gradually mold not only the external behavior of governments, but the internal expectations of the populations living under them. Over time, what begins as structural alignment becomes cultural conditioning. Once a nation's financial survival depends on maintaining credibility within the system, every political choice becomes filtered through the lens of economic acceptance. Leaders learn to craft policies not around long-term national interest, but around short-term market reactions. Elections become battles over who can better appease investors, not citizens. Debates shift from vision and sovereignty to interest rates, ratings, volatility, and fiscal discipline. Economic language replaces political language, until entire societies speak in terms the architecture defines. This influence reaches into social expectations as well. People begin shaping their lives around norms created by the system, borrowing to advance, consuming to stabilize growth, investing to protect themselves from instability the system itself generates. The financial logic becomes so ingrained that it stops feeling like a choice. It starts feeling like common sense. And when a population internalizes the system's logic, the architecture gains a level of control that no law, no treaty, no institution could ever achieve on its own. Even cultural values shift. Productivity becomes identity. Growth becomes morality. Stability becomes the ultimate measure of success. Nations judge themselves, not by the well-being of their people but by their performance within the system, GDP, investment inflows, credit ratings. And because these metrics define global prestige, governments shape their policies around improving numbers rather than improving lives. The architecture does not need to impose its priorities. Societies adopt them willingly. But the most revealing transformation happens when nations facing internal crises, whether political, social, or economic, still prioritize protecting. They're standing within the architecture above, addressing the root causes of their instability. It's not that they don't see the problems. It's that stepping outside the system's expectations feels more dangerous than letting the problems grow. This is how the architecture sustains itself through turmoil. It convinces nations that survival requires obedience, even when obedience worsens the very issues threatening stability. By the time a country reaches this stage, the system no longer needs crises or incentives to maintain control. The population itself enforces the logic. Leaders justify decisions based on what the markets might think. Citizens frame their security around financial norms. And the architecture becomes the silent authority guiding the future. Tell me in the comments if you've ever felt like economic rules shape society more than democratic choices. Your insight can reveal how deeply this system influences everyday life. As the system's influence seeped into the deeper layers of society, it began quietly shaping not only national behavior, but the emotional and psychological landscape of entire populations. People often believe economic structures operate only at the level of institutions, governments, and global markets. But the architecture exerts a far more intimate pressure. It shapes how individuals think about security, opportunity, ambition, and even identity. It defines what feels possible and what feels out of reach. Over time, living within, this structure alters not only what nations do, but how people believe life is supposed to work. When a society is conditioned to navigate constant cycles of credit, debt, and uncertainty, the population internalizes a subtle form of economic tension. Individuals grow up knowing they must borrow to advance and must remain productive to survive. This creates a psychological state where stability becomes a personal responsibility, even though the instability originates from forces far beyond individual control. And because the system rewards those who adapt quickly and punishes those who hesitate, people learn to measure their worth through efficiency, output, and financial resilience, rather than through well-being or community. This conditioning doesn't stop at individuals. It extends to families and social structures. Decisions about education, housing, healthcare, and even relationships become tied to economic calculations dictated by the architecture. A person's value, both in their own eyes and in society's expectations, slowly aligns with their ability to navigate the system's demands. The architecture reshapes cultural norms, subtly transforming financial stress into a normal part of life. a background pressure people assume is natural, even when it's entirely manufactured. On a broader scale, nations begin to experience a collective psychological effect. When public trust erodes, when institutions appear fragile, and when economic realities tighten, societies often develop a lingering sense of vulnerability. People start believing that downturns are unavoidable, that crises are inevitable, that uncertainty is permanent. This mindset discourages risk-taking, innovation, and long-term planning. It creates a population that reacts rather than anticipates, adapts rather than transforms. Exactly the environment in which the architecture thrives. These emotional patterns feed into political behavior as well. Fear of instability pushes voters toward leaders who promise economic protection rather than structural change. Anxiety about the future makes populations more willing to accept policies that limit autonomy, but promise short-term security. The architecture doesn't have to suppress dissent. It only has to maintain the illusion that deviation is dangerous. A society conditioned by uncertainty becomes its own enforcer. And while people believe they are making choices freely, they are often responding to pressures orchestrated far above their awareness. The system doesn't need to dictate behavior outright. It only needs to shape the environment in which decisions are made. Once that environment becomes the unquestioned reality, the architecture becomes indistinguishable from life itself. As societies adjusted to the psychological weight of the system, another illusion took hold. Perhaps the most powerful of all. The architecture created a sense of stability that felt solid on the surface, yet was mathematically unsustainable beneath it. Nations, institutions, and individuals began to operate under the belief that the rules of the financial world were reliable, predictable, and ultimately fair. But this belief masked the fundamental truth. The stability people depended on was engineered, conditional, and designed to keep them participating in a structure they could never fully step outside of. This illusion of stability is built on cycles that appear natural, but are anything but. Expansion, contraction, recovery, patterns that repeat with such regularity that they seem unavoidable. But each cycle reinforces the environment the architecture requires. When times are good, governments borrow more, markets inflate, and optimism spreads. People assume progress is permanent. But this optimism is precisely what positions nations for the next downturn. Once conditions shift, the same institutions that fueled expansion set the terms for survival, and the cycle begins again with even deeper dependency. What makes this dynamic so effective is that it disguises constraint as opportunity. The system encourages nations to pursue growth through leverage, investment, and integration, presenting these as pathways to modernization and global relevance. But each step forward binds them more tightly to the architecture, reducing the range of choices available when conditions change. By the time instability emerges, the idea of operating independently no longer feels feasible. The system conditions nations to react, within its boundaries, not beyond them. The mathematics behind this illusion are unforgiving. Debt expands faster than productivity. Markets rely on liquidity injections that must continually increase to sustain the appearance of stability. Growth depends not on real economic strength but on confidence, confidence that can evaporate in moments. The architecture doesn't fear volatility. It anticipates it, harnesses it, and uses it as reinforcement. The entire structure operates like a machine that must keep moving to avoid collapse, and the world is expected to move with it. Yet most people never see the fragility beneath the surface. They observe rising markets and interpret them as proof that the system works. They see periods of calm and assume crises are exceptions rather than features. They experience temporary stability and believe it reflects genuine security rather than orchestrated equilibrium. This illusion holds society in place because it gives people just enough reassurance to continue participating, even as the underlying numbers point toward outcomes that cannot be sustained indefinitely. The quiet truth is that the architecture doesn't need to hide its instability. It only needs to maintain the perception that the alternative is worse. As long as nations believe that stepping outside the system would trigger chaos, they will remain within its boundaries, even when those boundaries lead them closer to long-term vulnerability. the illusion of stability becomes the strongest form of control, not because it deceives people, but because it convinces them that they have no other choice. As the architecture reaches its full maturity, the consequences of its design become undeniable. Nations, institutions, and individuals are now operating in a world where escaping the system is no longer a theoretical concern. It is mathematically impossible without risking catastrophic disruption. Every decision, every policy, every financial movement flows through the structures created centuries ago, refined through crises and reinforced by global interconnections. It is no longer just a system of money, it is a framework that shapes reality itself, guiding economies, politics, and societies toward outcomes that serve the architecture's continuity rather than human prosperity. What is remarkable is how subtle the control is. No single law, decree, or agreement enforces participation. Instead, the system relies on incentives, expectations, and interdependencies so complex that nations feel they are making sovereign choices, even as they comply with a structure they cannot alter. Markets, interest rates, debt obligations, and global flows dictate behavior more effectively than any overt coercion could. And while citizens, leaders, and governments perceive freedom, they are moving within invisible lanes, constrained by rules designed to sustain the architecture indefinitely. This brings us to the most critical realization: understanding. The system is no longer optional. The moment you recognize how it operates, how every crisis reinforces it, and how every recovery strengthens its grip, you begin to see why nations appear trapped and why ordinary people feel powerless. Knowledge itself becomes a tool of awareness and preparation. By understanding the mechanisms of influence, the flow of debt, and the hidden levers of global finance, you can interpret events not as random or accidental, but as deliberate sequences shaped by a system built to endure. So, if you have followed this journey to the very end, it means you are ready to see the forces at work clearly. Take a moment to reflect and let me know in the comments with a phrase like, "This message was for me," if this perspective resonates with you. Your input matters, because acknowledging the reality of the system is the first step toward thinking strategically in a world that rarely explains itself. While you comment, consider liking the video if it helped you. See patterns you hadn't noticed before, and make sure you are subscribed, because the deeper layers of how this architecture influences politics, societies, and your own life will be explored in future content. And finally, there is more to understand beyond this analysis. There is another video waiting that examines how these mechanisms interact with real-world events today, revealing the hidden pathways that perpetuate dependency, crisis, and control. Click over to continue exploring and join me as we uncover the patterns that govern the economic world we live in. The story doesn't end here. It's only expanding, and the more you see, the better equipped you are to recognize the invisible forces shaping every aspect of modern life.